last week we started talking about something that is near and dear to my heart, and that is gardening. We talked about how to grow basil, how to get the biggest basil plants in creation to grow in your garden. No, I'm kidding. We did talk about basil, but it was actually in reference to the biblical principle that we can learn and pertain to our lives as it pertains to us getting out of our comfort zone. Last week, just to recap a little bit, we said that this basil plant was planted at the same time as these basil plants. I planted these myself from seeds. But because this plant was not taken out of this starter pot and planted in the soil, it was not allowed to continue to grow. What happens is the roots take up so much space, and there's not enough room for it to dive deep into the soil and pull the nutrients out of the soil. Now, we said we looked at this one, and this one never got any further than where it started. It was in the same pot, grown at the same time as these other basil plants, but the difference is this plant was not taken out of its comfort zone and transplanted into fertile soil and allowed to reach its full potential. Whereas these plants here were they were transplanted out of their comfort zone. They were taken out of their comfort zone, and they were able to reach their full potential. And I said this last week, but I have never, ever planted plants from a seed before. When growing up, we always went to the nursery and grabbed a flat of whatever we wanted, whether it's basil. I mean, that was always in there, but basil and tomatoes and so many different things. But this was the first time I grew them from seeds, and that just amazed me. It amazed me. But this is us when we don't come out of our comfort zone, and this is us when we come out of our comfort zone and allow God to bring us to our maximum potential. So that's what we did last week. So this week we are going to continue talking about basil for believers, but this is part 2. I think I'm ringing just a little bit. If you can just bring me down just a hair. But when I began preparing this message this week, I never originally planned to go any further than last week. But as I began to study the principle behind this whole getting out of our comfort zone, I just talked to the Lord and I asked him to speak to me. And as he spoke, I just started writing things down. And by the time I got done, well, really, by the time I got halfway through, my mind was blown, because you're gonna understand why in a minute. But I know that the Lord has more for us through this basil. So as I was writing, I began to notice something interesting was emerging. The illustration that I thought was just something fun has a deeper meaning, and it actually contains the blueprint to get us to come out of our comfort zone. So it's nice when something comes together, but it's always better when the Lord speaks clearly, and I know that the Lord spoke clearly about this. But so today we're going to talk about what steps we need to take to get us out of our comfort zone. And if you're taking notes, you'll want to get a piece of paper out, and on the left-hand side of your paper, write the letters in five different rows, BASIL, because today we're going to talk about the steps we need to take in order to be freed from the confines of our comfort zone. And we're going to be using what I call the Basil principle. The Basil principle. No, this is not an Italian message, but we're going to make it. So we're going to use these letters to lay out the blueprint that will effectively free us from the confines of our comfort zones. Now, a statement was made last week that bears repeating, so I'm going to repeat it again this week. If it will come up on the screen. No. Next one. There we go. If we don't... Oh, go ahead. Go back. Technology. If we don't step out of our comfort zones, we allow our comfort zones to be our prison. Now, that having been said, we've established the fact that none of us would like to be in prison, but unfortunately, when we don't allow ourselves to come out of our comfort zone and allow God to stretch us, we basically put ourselves in a prison because we keep ourselves locked away inside our comfort zone, and it prohibits the Lord from working through us in ways that we could have never imagined. When we don't allow ourselves to be removed from our comfort zone and transplanted into fertile soil, we prohibit ourselves from ever reaching our full potential. So today we're going to revisit one of the passages we read last week because it pertains beautifully to this week as well. And this is the story about Peter and the disciples out on the Sea of Galilee. And we pick it up in verse 25 in Matthew 14. It says, about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried, "It's a ghost." But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage. I am here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over to the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. He actually walked on the water. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back in the boat, the wind stopped and the disciples worshiped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed. Now, just to give you a little backstory on what's happening, the disciples are in a boat. Jesus sent them across the Sea of Galilee, and he was gonna meet up with them later on. Jesus came back to keep the crowds, stayed behind to keep the crowd under control, and then he was going up into the mountains to pray. So it got late, and the sea started to turn things up, and the wind started to blow. They were in the middle of a storm out on the Sea of Galilee. So Jesus started to walk out toward them. In the middle of the night, Jesus started walking on the water, and the word says that the disciples were terrified. Now, I would say that would be a valid response, that they're terrified. But these are people who have seen Jesus time and time again perform impossible feats. Things that are humanly impossible. Yet when they saw him coming out, they got afraid. They were terrified, the word says. And they said, "This must be a ghost." But while the rest of the disciples were questioning whether or not they believed what was actually happening, Peter had a different mindset. And from Peter, we're going to get the first couple of steps right here in our Basil principle. Before Peter called out to Jesus, he had to believe that it was in fact Jesus. He also had to believe that Jesus can do impossible things. But not only that, he had to believe that Jesus can perform impossible miracles through Peter, through himself. So the first thing that we have to do in our Basil principle is believe. You know, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but walking on the water is physically impossible. I don't care how much you believe in yourself. When you step out on the water, that water is displaced And that ocean would swallow you up in a heartbeat. But not when Jesus is on the scene. Because we believe that he can do the impossible. But we have to believe not just that he can do the impossible, but that he can do the impossible in our lives, in our situations. You know, now Peter was a fisherman. He spent much of his time out on the ocean. So he was very familiar with water and the properties of water. You know, it might have been 2,000 years ago, but water then has the same physical properties of water now. I wouldn't want any water that old around, but the basic principles, the basic properties of the water are the same. So, but he believed that Jesus can do the impossible. Even before he asked to be called out of the boat, he had believed that Jesus could do it. So the first step is believe. And Peter had to believe that Jesus can do the impossible. So we must believe that nothing is impossible with God. Luke 1:37 says nothing is impossible with God. And then Philippians 4:13 says, I can do all things through Christ which strengthens me. Now, I'm sure Peter knew that Jesus could do the impossible things. But he had to believe that Jesus can do the impossible in his life and through him. And only after we accept the fact that nothing is impossible for God, only then can we move on to step 2, which is ask. Only after Peter believed that Jesus can do the impossible did he ask him to do the impossible in his life. What good is asking if you don't first believe that it can be, that it can happen? And sometimes we look at our situations. We look at the situation we're in, and we say, you know what? This is an impossible situation. And you know what? In our own strength, maybe whatever you're going through is an impossible situation. But when Jesus steps on the scene, when he comes and walks out on that water toward you, the impossible becomes possible. So once we believe that the impossible could become possible, then we ask Jesus to work in our lives. For the sake of time, we won't turn to all of these, but if you're taking notes, you can write these down. Jesus tells us in Scripture in numerous places that when we come to him and ask anything of him, we must first believe. So in Matthew 21:22, it says, if you believe, these are all words of Jesus, by the way. If you believe, you will receive whatever you ask in prayer. Mark 11:24 says, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it and it will be yours. And then again in John 14:13 and 14, it says, Jesus is talking here, and I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it. So first we must believe that Jesus can do the impossible. And then we have to ask. We have to ask him to stretch us. And only after the first 2 steps are completed, because there's an order to this, can we move on to the next one. It's important that we believe before we ask, because if we didn't believe first, we're just wasting our breath. Because we don't believe it can be done. We're just arbitrarily speaking. But when we believe and then ask, we expect something miraculous to take place. Something that's miraculous to us, but not God. He created the universe in 7 days. I think he's capable of dealing with our situations. I think he's capable of walking on water. If he created water, if he created the universe, who are we to think he can't control it? You know, what we see as a mountain, God sees as a molehill. What we see, listen to this, what we see as an impassable body of water in front of us, God sees as divine pavement to get you where you need to go. I'm going to repeat that because that was good. What we see as an impassable body of water in front of us, God sees as divine pavement to get you to where he wants you to be. That's good. But without first believing that he can do the impossible, it does no good to ask because we're not believing. But once we believe, then we can ask for the impossible, and then we can move on to step 3. It's actually 2 parts, and it's 3 and 4. Peter asked, he believed first, then he asked to be called out onto the water. Then he had to step out of the boat and initiate the impossible. When we ask God for the impossible, we have to be willing to step out of the boat and initiate the impossible. That doesn't mean that we perform the impossible, but if Peter had stood in that boat and said, Lord, call me out of my comfort zone. I want to walk on the water. I want to walk toward you. And Jesus said, okay, come on. And Peter stood there and didn't move his feet. And he just stayed inside the boat. Never got out of his comfort zone. This story may not have landed in the Bible. Maybe it would have because Jesus walked on the water. But it made it so much more personal because Peter, an ordinary human being, asked Jesus to do the impossible through him. He believed, he asked Jesus to help him to step out of that boat, to call him out. And then he had to take the initiative and step out of the boat. Once Jesus said, okay, this is what I want you to do. It's up to us to take the next step because it's up to us to step out of the boat and initiate the impossible. Peter didn't just believe that Jesus can do the impossible. Peter asked Jesus to do the impossible, but he didn't leave it there. When Jesus called him, he put logical thinking aside. Sometimes we try to reason or have rationale behind what the Lord wants us to do. But if it was logical, if we can understand it, if it was something that we can complete on our own, we would not need divine intervention. We would not need Jesus to do a miraculous thing in our life. Because why are we going to ask him to help us to move this podium from one point to the other when we know we can do it? But when we ask him to do the impossible, when Peter asked him to call him out onto the water and walk and allow him to walk out on the water, Peter put logical thinking aside. And he said, Lord, if you tell me to do it, if you call me out, nothing is going to hold me back. I'm going to step out of this boat. I am going to initiate the impossible task that you have called me to do. If we're not willing to step out of the boat and initiate the impossible, then we're not able to go to the next step. But how many of us have asked the Lord to give us an opportunity to lead someone to the Lord? You know, we oftentimes pray and ask the Lord to send people in our path that we can minister to, that we can share our faith with. Yet when that time comes, how many of us don't step out of the boat? To us, salvation seems impossible because it is on our own strength. It is in our own power impossible. But it's only through Jesus dying on the cross that we can truly be saved. But how many of us forego the opportunity of sharing our faith because we're not willing to come out of our comfort zone? How many of us pray the prayer, Lord, bring someone in my path that I could minister to? And then when we're even in the checkout line at Walmart or we're at work and work is a big one because we're not supposed to share our faith at work. We're not supposed to talk about controversial things. Now, I would not recommend that you talk about politics, but sharing your faith, is a different story. If you have an opportunity to share your faith in the workplace, as long as you are not going to get in trouble, and sometimes that risk is warranted depending on the situation. But if you don't share your faith at work, if they're not seeing a difference in your life, we're not stepping out of the boat and initiating the impossible. All we're doing is saying that we believe. We're asking for something that we're not willing to step out of the boat for. We're asking for something that we're not willing to initiate the impossible for. Definitely some food for thought. But if we're ever going to leave our comfort zones, we must first believe that nothing is impossible with God. Then we must ask the Lord to stretch us. Then, just as Peter did, when he stepped out on the water, we need to step out of our comfort zone and initiate the impossible. Now, after we accomplish all these steps, the journey isn't over. Yes, there's another letter. But the journey is not over. The most important step is yet to come. And without the next step, all the others are meaningless. You can't just jump down to step 3 without first completing step 1 and step 2. There is a process to this. That's why I said this is the blueprint. This is the blueprint that we follow to get out of our comfort zone. If we don't first believe and ask, then we can't step out of the boat. If we step out of the boat and we don't believe that Jesus can save us, if we don't believe that we can walk on the water through Jesus' strength, then it doesn't matter. We can step out on that boat and we are going to sink. Because what did it say about Peter? Peter did step out of the boat. Peter did walk on the water. The only human being in history that walked on water. But what happened? It says Peter went over to the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. So Peter stepped out of the boat. He initiated the impossible. But then when it came right down to it, he took his eyes off of Jesus and allowed the cares of life to overcome him. And once his focus came off of the Lord, once his focus came off of Jesus and he stopped making that beeline toward Jesus, focused, then he immediately began to sink. If we learn from Peter's mistake, we can successfully complete our blueprint. Because we look at what Peter did when he did not focus on Jesus. Jesus was performing a miracle at the very time Peter began to sink. That's an interesting point, because Peter was in the midst of a miracle. Peter was in the midst of the impossible becoming possible. He was walking literally in a miracle. Yet he still took his eyes off the Lord. Yet he still looked at what was going on around him. And just like the others on the boat, he became terrified and began to sink. How many of us do that? How many of us can say that we've taken our eyes off Jesus at times? Even when we know that Jesus is working miracles in our life and we've seen him work miracles in our family, in the workplace. Yet we take our eyes off the Lord and immediately we begin to sink. So if we continue here and we finish up our blueprint there, the last key element is for us to look up. Whoop. Corey, go back one, please. Is that we look up. So we have to believe. We have to believe that Jesus can do the impossible in us. And then we have to ask him. We have to ask him to do the impossible in our life. Then we have to be willing to step out of our comfort zone, to step out of the boat and initiate the impossible. And after all of the 1 through 4 is complete, after all those steps are completed, we have to remember that we must focus on the Lord. We always have to look up. Because as soon as we divert our attention from what the Lord has us doing, that's when the temptation comes back. That's when the things that we've struggled with come back and torment us. That's when the devil has his foothold in our life again, because we've given him the opportunity to come into our life and say, listen, maybe God can do it for somebody else, but he can't do it for you. And that's the place the devil wants you to be. Because he wants you to think that God cannot do the impossible in your life. When all we have to do is keep our eyes focused on him, and the impossible becomes possible. I like how Hebrews 12 puts this. In the New Living Translation, Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 reads like this. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, that means since there's so many people constantly staring at us, waiting for us to slip up, they're just waiting for us to slip up, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. Especially those things that we have difficulty with, especially those addictions, especially the spending time where we know we shouldn't. When we lay aside those weights that so easily trips us up and takes up all of our time, let us run with endurance the race that God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, by looking up. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross. He endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. But we do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus. Don't let the cares of this life overtake your blessing to do the impossible through Christ. By allowing the cares of this life to distract you from achieving all that God has for you. Don't allow yourself to be stuck in the pot. Allow yourself to be transplanted. Allow yourself to be transplanted. You know, one of these leaves are half the size of this entire plant because it was allowed to actually more than half the size of the plant. One leaf. Because it simply allowed itself to be transplanted. It smells good. It allowed itself to be transplanted so it didn't have to remain a small, insignificant plant that has little value, little worth. But when it came out of its comfort zone and it was allowed to be transplanted into fertile soil, this could be every one of us here. It could be every one of us here, but you know, the potential in this little plant is realized in those plants right there. Which one are we going to be? Are we going to be this one? Or are we going to be those? Now, automatically we say, oh no, I don't want to be the little one. I know I don't want to be the little one. Of course, we want to be this one. But are we willing? Are we willing to apply the Basil principle? Are we willing to believe that Jesus can do the impossible? And then are we ready to ask him to do the impossible in us? And then are we willing to step out? Are we willing to step out and initiate the impossible in our life? Once we take that first step, we allow God to take over. But we have to step out in faith first and initiate the impossible, and then we look up. So Peter took his eyes off of Jesus, and the moment he did, his capacity to allow the Lord to perform the impossible through him evaporated. The moment he took his eyes off Jesus, the impossible, which had become possible, remember he was walking in it, the impossible became possible. But the moment that he took his eyes off of Jesus, the impossible that became possible became impossible again. Did that mean that Jesus wasn't capable? Did that mean Jesus was not capable of keeping Peter on the top of that water? Not at all. Not at all. But it's a perfect example of allowing the cares of this life to distract us. And when we do get distracted, just like Peter, we begin to sink. Does that mean that Jesus is not capable of working miracles in our life? Does that mean that he's not capable of making the impossible possible in our life? What's the variable here? The variable is us. We have to be willing to follow these steps. Now, they may seem pretty easy steps, but it's not always an easy process. It's not always an easy process, because in order to step out of that boat, I guarantee you that was not an easy thing for Peter to do. That was not an easy thing for Peter to do. Even though he knew that Jesus could do the impossible. It was not easy for Peter to do that. How many times do we ask God to do things in our life, but the solution that he provides is not an easy solution? The solution that he provides is uncomfortable. How many of us would be willing to be uncomfortable for the impossible to happen in our life? Now again, we all say, yeah, because we see the outcome. But if all you saw was this plant, could you have ever imagined that what's in this pot could ever wind up like that? Because we don't see the final product. We don't always see the end of the road. The Lord doesn't always lay it out for us. We have to have faith that if we allow ourselves to come out of our comfort zone and allow ourselves to be transplanted, allow ourselves to draw the nutrients from the soil, and that's diving into his word and learning more about him, drawing closer to the Lord. If we don't allow ourselves to go through that process, we will always be stuck here. We will always be stuck here. And you know what? I said this last week. Each one of these leaves has a certain degree of flavor to them. But if you even smelled the leaves from this plant, they will smell and taste dramatically different to these here. Because this plant, while it did grow, is starving every step of the way. It's starving. It's starving. So it starts to feed on itself because it can't get nutrients anywhere else. And then you have a plant like this that can draw the nutrients out of the soil. These plants have been in the Word. These plants have been in church. They've been fellowshipping with other believers. They've been praying. They've been spending time with the Lord. And they go from this to that. But it's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing because it's so easy to just sit back and say, I'm not going to do it. It's so easy to say, I don't need to do it. I'm okay. I still have some flavor. I still have some potential. but your potential can never be realized until you step out of the boat. So in order for us to effectively be freed from the confines of our comfort zone, we have to remember to apply the Basil principle. I should get a bumper sticker made. The Basil principle. But we have to believe that Jesus can do the impossible. Then it's up to us to ask, like Peter. It's up to us to ask the Lord to do the impossible in us. Then when Jesus gives us the okay and he starts doing the impossible in us, we have to step out of the boat. We have to initiate the impossible. And then through all of that, we must remember to continually keep our eyes on him. Because the moment that we divert our attention from the things of the Lord, the moment that we divert our attention away from the Lord, away from the blessings, away from the miracle that he's working in each one of our lives, the moment we cease to look up, we start to go down. The moment we cease to look up, we begin to go down. And that's just where the devil wants us to be. That's why he's going to do his best to put everything in your path to divert your attention away from what the Lord has for you. And maybe the Lord isn't calling you into ministry. Maybe that's not even what I'm talking about. Each one of us has a calling on our life to spread the gospel. Each one of us has an obligation to the Lord to make his good news known. But if we don't ever step out of the boat, and if we don't keep our eyes on him, that's never going to happen. So this morning, this is our blueprint. This is our blueprint. You know what? I'm going to put this on the internet. I'm going to put this on Facebook. So you don't forget it. Always, the next time you look at a basil leaf, you're not going to think of it the same way. It's not just an herb anymore. It's a blueprint. It is a blueprint. We have to believe that Jesus can do the impossible, ask him to do the impossible through us. Then we step out of the boat, initiate the impossible, and keep our eyes focused on him. I'm going to ask us all to bow our heads this morning.